So hi everybody, my name is Debbie Truss. I work alongside Kev. I'm the Principal Youth Work Specialist at the National Youth Agency. And I always feel at this point, I've also got to say, and I'm also a youth worker and community worker. So I'm based up in a little town called Blackpool. Some of you may know it. And so I still do some community work and some youth work up in Blackpool as well. And Kev asked me if I would be able to come along today to be able to talk about loss and about grief. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some PowerPoints, but this is very much about us being able to talk as a group of practitioners and to maybe to share some of our experiences, some of our best practices. So while I may be sitting here, should I say, in my front room and showing some PowerPoints, I'd really like us to be able to get engaged and to talk that through. And as Kev said, we are recording this, so for some of our colleagues, they may be able to grab a brew one night after they've watched Coronation Street or something, thought, oh, I'll just look at the loss and grief webinar and maybe get some ideas and some tips. So I'm going to share my screen with you all. So just bear with me while I do that. Can everybody see that okay? Yeah, okay, so as I said, this is about loss and grief, in particular in the youth work sector. But one of the things that I really wanted to, and Kev's also done the induction, so we're okay. But something I just wanted to say before we actually start is that this is ultimately a very emotive subject. So what I would say is that if at any point any of this is a trigger for anybody, or anybody wants to, turn their screen off and go and get a brew and then come back later on, please do that. I've delivered this webinar quite a few times. I was very fortunate to deliver it to some of our colleagues over in the Commonwealth, some youth and community workers, and it does bring some emotions, because at the end of the day, we're only human, and we're all dealing with either working or living within a pandemic as well. So please, a bit about self-care as well. I hope you've got a nice brew or a nice drink next to you, or a biscuit is always lovely, and let's talk this through. So as I said, I've been introduced to you obviously in who I am. So some element of obviously today in terms of looking at some of the reflective outcomes. Ideally, what I'd like us to talk about is to explore, youth work practitioners' ownership of looking at resilience and how we first of all, frame our assumptions of what our self-care is. As youth workers, we're going to be talking through about how we support young people, perhaps through loss and through grief, but actually something that we need to really step back and say as well, what about our self-care and how are we ready? I always do the analogy of, we can drive a car, but if we don't put enough, fuel in that car, it'll stop and it'll go nowhere, and then no one's able to take that journey. Examine maybe some of the variation of support and looking at maybe what assets are available, to support a young person through loss and grief. And again, this is where I'll be asking us, to share some of our experiences. We've got the group chat, so please feel free to talk about that in the group chat as well. Another thing was about exploring the role of cultural competency, and I'm going to go through that. There was a report written last year around cultural competency and who's actually best placed to work alongside young people to get young people's voices heard and for them to really take lead of their own self-care as well. And hopefully if we've got time at the end, just to reflect on some of the discourse surrounding youth work specialisms and explore actually the impact on our workforce and look at some of those positive interventions as well. So as I've said, please feel free, I'll talk to the cows come home, but please, open up your mic, jump in at any point, share some experiences, that would be really good. Does anybody have any questions before we continue? Just to say as well, we've got the amazing Stephen who's in the background. So should your Wi-Fi suddenly cut out, or if you're homeschooling and there's too many people on your devices and you suddenly get thrown out of the webinar, please just jump back on again. Stephen will be waiting for you and put you in the waiting room, and we can bring you straight back into the webinar. Okay, thank you. So just wanted to put a couple of things into context really in regards to actually where we're at from the NYA perspective. And for those of you who may not know, but we have we've obviously got a website, but we've also got a youth support website as well that we developed with our colleagues at UK Youth in the Mix and Federation of Detached Youth Work. And we also were able to produce some of the some reports. So one of the reports that we produced in terms of England was actually looking at the impact of what COVID-19 has really had on young people at the moment, and really to start being able to highlight some of those significant themes of where young people have and continue to experience loss in a variety of ways. Now, loss is a word that I'm going to use quite often within this. And what we're going to do later on in the webinar is we're actually going to unpick that to actually say, what does that mean? So just bear with me on that, because this is some of the language and how we frame our language and what that means to us as youth workers, but also what that means to young people. So if you haven't had a chance to read that Outside report, please do so. It's on our website, and it lends for some very interesting reading. One of the main ones that came out was actually when we're talking about loss, is actually about, you know, what that has an impact on young people. And I know that for many of us, you know, we would hear in the papers, or we'd hear colleagues, or well, not particularly colleagues, but certainly friends or family saying, you know, oh, well, you know, young people are thrilled they're not going to school shut down. But actually, for a lot of young people, for the majority of it, that was a massive loss in their routine. You know, that was a loss in terms of being able to see their friends, or for many young people who were working alongside, was actually for them to get out of possibly a home situation, and actually school was a safe haven. And I found this really powerful. Some of the research that my colleagues found when they were doing this report was actually looking at in terms of what the impact is in terms of when we talk about that loss, particularly for young people. You know, on side in particular, our partners were saying, you know, especially children with autism and young people, you know, they've really been struggling as they're out of sync with their routine. And I'm sure many of you have probably seen that either with the young people that you're working alongside, or possibly your own children as well. And again, I found that this was really interesting, that you know, before Easter, only 5% of vulnerable children were known to be at risk by social services. So that's you know, that's only 5% of possibly 360,000 young people, you know, from vulnerable families. So it lends for some quite concerning quite concerning reading. And again, Brooke, one of our other partners who helped us develop this report, was looking at saying, you know, over 1 million young people have self-reported mental health issues. Now, we know as a collective of practitioners that rate has gone up even further. Certainly, I can only speak in terms of my practice in Blackpool, but and in particular around young men, but the increase in the mental health and the mental health well-being of young men who choose to take their own lives as a way has gone ridiculously high in Blackpool. I have a friend of mine who owns a funeral parlour, and he actually said to me, sorry, not a funeral parlour, like a funeral directors, and he actually said that in terms of people taking their lives, in particular men, within the first 6 months of COVID, that had actually doubled compared to actually the whole of this 12 months. And I find that quite, you know, when you hear those statistics, you know, so there is clearly some huge issues that we are facing now as youth workers, that young people are, but certainly in the time to come as well. And again, a lot of that is in terms of is around that loss. Is everybody all right so far? I can't see you, so I might just get someone to say yes, we're okay. We're okay?
Yep.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah,
great.
okay.
Yes, fine.
Thank you. Great. Okay. Something else that I just wanted to explore, and again, this is just about putting in context, and it's all within this report, is very much around the loss of, like I said, the loss of homes and the loss of security. Again, you know, we can talk this through in terms of where people are, but certainly in regards to young people who were already homeless, or as we like to call them, sofa surfing. But again, that has massively increased in those risks to those young people. You know, we talk about the toxic trio of young people living within households that are around, you know, the poor mental health, that might be substance abuse or addiction, and also that added layer of domestic abuse. And again, speaking from what I've seen within social media, you know, a lot of those sort of like moral panics of people saying, you know, there's young people on the streets and they're causing mayhem and nothing's being done, and the police should round them up and take them back home. But there wasn't really an understanding or an awareness from those people who were saying those comments about actually the street or the bus stop or the park actually might be the safest place for that young person to currently be, because actually going home is no option. You know, that may either be going home's no option in terms of because of the situation, because of the issues and the vulnerability, or it might be that there's actually no home to physically go to. And obviously what we found, especially within COVID, was a lot of the young people's homeless shelters, there was obviously a reduction in terms of how many young people they could admit as well. You know, you might have an 8-bedroom homeless temporary accommodation that might have had to be reduced to 4 because of the issue around social distancing as well. So there's some real key links here, I think, that in terms of when we're talking about loss for young people, it's about actually how do we actually frame that. Bear with me. Okay. One of the things, just to be able to wrap this element of up, and then for us before we go on, is, you know, we're talking about the impact of loss around the impact on young people. And one of the things I just thought was really key here was about actually being able to listen to young people's concerns, you know, actually finding out, you know, what is it, what can we do, what can we do in terms of support, what assets do we need, what support, what funding, what services. And I think what was very clear in terms of actually looking at this, when we hopefully, and I'm very confident when we look at when COVID, you know, when we're out of this lockdown, when we're out of, you know, these restrictions, is for us as collectively, as a group of practitioners and as a sector, to have a clear exit strategy for lockdown. So actually listening to young people's voices, making them obviously be the leaders in this, you know. So actually what can we do to be able to support young people? And again, that's more than just simply, you know, the schools being open. I mean, what was key certainly for us as a sector was that we got the key worker status, you know, which massively supported us in terms of us being able to offer more of a service to young people, which I think was absolutely crucial. So I'm just going to pause there just for a moment, and just to be able to look at this now and to actually start talking through some element. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a minute. And I'm just going to ask, has anybody got any comments on what I've said so far? Anybody got any thoughts? Everybody really quiet?
I think it's really interesting the way you're talking about loss. I wasn't 100% expecting it, but I think the way you're talking about loss of routine and loss of services and stuff in COVID is really important and sometimes overlooked. Like, I know I automatically thought like death, like, or loss of people, but actually all of those things involve grief as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that we're certainly going to explore further, Amanda. And I think it is about that terminology of and how we frame our language, because we say loss, and actually what does that mean? So it's it is interesting for us just to unpick that. There was a really good and I know that we talk about social media and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, but what was really interesting, there was a person that put a tweet out this morning to say about loss, and actually said, people say that, you know, especially if we're talking about grief and death, I've lost my parent, or I've lost my friend. She said, no, I haven't. She said, they have died. She said, I haven't lost them. She said, my father has died. So there's no loss. I've not, no, I can't go off and find him somewhere. So again, I think it's about how we interpret that, but also how we talk about that. And it was a really interesting thread of discussions about people coming from a really good place to be able to talk that through, and about how do we talk about grief, and how do we talk about loss, but do we actually need to separate those when we're talking that through? Anybody else got any? No, you happy for me to continue? I'll just keep on stopping so we can breathe, and then we can talk this through even more. So I'll continue to share if it'll let me. Bear with. I always feel like I sound like Miranda when I say that, because she used to say it, isn't it? Bear with, we're okay. Okay, can you got that? Okay, so again, and I think this really lends to what you said, Amanda, before, about in terms of what is our loss and frame and where we are. And I think that what is really interesting is about actually, if we can sit back and say, okay, here we are, we're a group of practitioners, we're sat in a Zoom webinar. So let's think about this. So regardless of who we are, you know, our backgrounds, culture, gender, you know, where we are in the country. I'm in Blackpool, I'm sure somebody will be down south, and we're all across the country. Our lifestyle, you know, we all have one common experience, and that is loss. you know, at one time or several times in our lives, we will experience that. But as we've said about, well, but what does that mean? And how do we as individuals and also as youth work practitioners, what do we perceive actually as a loss? So I'm going to give you something to do, because obviously as a youth worker, we have to put you out into breakout rooms and get you to start talking. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do is think of a time when you've lost something. So I'm not talking about a bereavement, I'm talking about an actual loss. And I'd like you to, if you feel comfortable, how did that make you feel as a person? And do you still think of that loss now? So I'm going to give you roughly about 10 minutes in your group to do that. So each person has about 1 minute to tell their story. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like somebody to offer to be either a volunteer spokesperson to come back, but just to maybe share that person's story. Okay. Is everybody all right? That's so one thing about a loss, but it's not a bereavement. It's about when you a loss of something. So we'll give you about 10 minutes, and then we'll bring you back into the room. Is that okay? So I think Stephen is going to put you into breakout rooms now. You should receive a little message that will say, please tick on this link, and we'll get you into there. Is that all right, Stephen? Wendy, are you okay? Have you found it? Have you got a message just for you to say to go in? Have you got it? I think it's recording now. Okay. So yeah, we talk about, for those of you who don't know, but when I was trained as a youth worker, you know, I'd always get, you know, advised by my tutors, and when I had my mentors, and it was many years ago, you kind of like got a toolbox, you know, and we dip into that toolbox as such in terms of, you know, what pops our skills or our knowledge base, you know, and we base that, you know, around what our national occupation standards are and what skills are expected from us. But when we then start thinking about this loss, and especially within a pandemic and some of those emerging vulnerabilities, it's really interesting for us to start thinking about actually how equipped are we, you know, in terms of that, and actually, do we dare say we're not equipped, and what is it that we actually need? So I'm going to put you back into groups, but I'm going to give you a bit more time to talk about this. So what I'd like you to be thinking about is, and we're going to be picking this more around to us about, you know, that the grief and loss. Maybe we'll just stick to props. Well, we can do all grief, loss and trauma, but can you maybe think of possibly 10 examples off the top of your head, you know, possibly within your geographical area, of 10 examples of the types of grief or loss or trauma that a young person may experience? You know, you can be thinking possibly of a young person that you might particularly know, but just come up with an agreed sort of like top 10, and then what we can do, we can feed that back with each other. So yeah, if I give you about 15 minutes, is that all right with everyone to get your top 10? Yeah, I'll just stop sharing. Yeah, we're okay with that. Stephen, again, we'll send you a little request for you to go into your breakout rooms, and we'll go from there. So what did we think about that posing question for you to come together as a couple of groups to talk about that? Was it the task? Was it something that you were able to start think about quite quickly in terms of those 10 particular areas? Anybody want to share some of them that you have? Maybe we'll do it between the groups. Who wants to be?
Well, we talked about, I mean, we sort of covered, we didn't get 10 because we just had discussions and stuff.
That's fine, Shell, that's fine.
But we were talking about, like, you know, like the trauma and loss with young people living within the domestic abuse situation. And, you know, if dad is the perpetrator and that maybe he's gone to prison or is asked to leave the house, then there's a massive loss to that young person. Even though they've witnessed everything that's been happening, they've still lost a parent, haven't they?
Yeah.
And so, you know, that is like huge for young people, and the trauma attached to that.
Yeah, and I think, Shell, you brought up a really good point, because, you know, before you went to the breakout rooms, the discussion was had about, and I think, Steph, was it you that said about, you know, when you're experiencing loss, but then you can look back and say, actually, what have you gained in regards to that? But I think that's a really good example of what you said, especially around domestic abuse, or I think any type of abuse. And again, speaking from experience, working alongside young people who have, who are, within that abuse cycle, the first thing that, young people will say to you, especially if they disclose to you, is, what's going to happen. And if we turn around and say, well, it's going to be okay, straight away, we're actually saying, no, it's not, because their whole world is going to turn upside down. And whether or not that might be like I said, a loss of a parent being taken away, or them being taken away, or losing with their siblings or their friends, or for a lot of young people who are obviously living in care as well, there's a whole magnitude of things around that loss. And I just think this sort of process for us as youth work practitioners, that we can actually step back and go, okay, what is it really like to feel that loss? Just allows us to maybe to develop some of that cultural competency, what we talked about before, George, but allows us to really step back and think, right, actually, how are those young people feeling? So thank you so much for that, Shell.
Sorry, and also it's for just thinking of some of the young people out, it's about rejection as well. They feel rejected, and I'm just thinking about a young girl that I work with at the minute who lives with her nan, and because mum is unable to look after her because of her mental health, dad has been in prison due to criminality, and now her behaviour is so off the wall that nan can't look after her, so they're looking at care proceedings for her. So for that particular young girl, who is only just 12, is humongous loss, trauma, grief, bereavement, everything there for her.
Yeah, she's gone through that. Thank you for that, Shell. Anybody else want to share in terms of when you went through and to develop a list? Anybody from the other group?
I've got the list, so I'll just say it. But yeah, so our group, some of them were amazing just in terms of the insight. So
thanks, Steph.
Oh, I love this one. So this one was from Lauren, like the loss of in-between time. So, like when you at the bus stop and you just have a moment to yourself, or you like, from corporate, when I was in the office, we used to say like, the water cooler conversation, like just that loss of just that. And I suppose alongside that we had the sense of loss of spontaneity as well.
Yes. So, yeah, that's a good point.
Those were quite, different to the normal ones we know of, things that we don't always think of.
But again, Steph, in your group, did you identify that as being really crucial? Because I suppose that's something that we're within this pandemic, we're actually we're not taking for granted things that we did take for granted. So if you're saying, that those conversations at the bus stop, Lauren, or being able to meet with people, it's something that we don't have now, do we?
Yeah, and like you said, mental health, like you said in the beginning, we don't even, those things that are good for our souls that we're not even aware of until it's taken away from us. So yeah,
that's some really, really good points. Thank you for sharing that. Does anybody else? Sorry, go on, Steph. Yeah, of course you can. Yeah.
Somebody else. I mean, we also had, the normal ones, but loss of horizonness. I like that one. So the idea of being able to see beyond, because we can't, and, we had some analogies around that as well. Just what's beyond the horizon, being able to visualize it and see it and have, I suppose, hope attached to that, and we spoke about like if you're living in a block of flats and you can see, you're blocked by the building in front of you can't see past that,
Yeah. So, and how do we feel, because what the posing question was about equipping us as youth workers. I mean, this is an open question to everybody. How do we feel about having that, that toolbox, dipping in and being able to have that? Do we feel as though that we are equipped, placing ourselves obviously within a pandemic as well, are we equipped to be able to deal with, is probably the wrong analogy, but to be able to respond to the loss that the young people that we know are experiencing? Lauren, do you want to unmute yourself?
I was just going to say that I guess that sort of would depend on the individual in many ways, because lots of people have been, as we were talking about in the first breakout room, lots of people have been trying to juggle sort of parenting and their jobs and other things. And I think being in the pandemic, everybody will have a day where they think I'm equipped to deal with this, and everybody will have a day where they go, no, I can't give any more out than what I'm already sort of giving. And I think it's quite a personal thing.
Yeah. So is it back to that analogy of actually I may just need to go back to the petrol station and fill it with a bit of diesel or fill up with a bit of unleaded and start the car back up again?
Exactly that.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that's so important, isn't it, in terms of that self-care, and for us to be able to recognise that and to be able to share that with colleagues.
I sorry, I was just going to say, I also don't think it's useful for a youth worker to be, what's the word, like invincible to a young person, and that it's really important for them to know that adults, air quotes, are also sort of having their own kind of struggles, and it's not just the young people themselves that are the only people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you, Lauren. George, were you going to say something as
Yeah,
well?
I was just thinking in terms of our toolboxes, we certainly need them more to be like Mary Poppins bag and dig a bit deeper in a new way to find some of those tools. There was a really interesting conversation that was emerging in our group around kind of equality, particularly around voice and influence or participation work, and how we ensure young people's voices are being heard. And I was kind of reflecting our more kind of formal groups that may have existed for voice and influence can take place over Zoom, but how do we reach those young people that perhaps wouldn't normally engage in having the say to make sure their voices are heard? Because when we were out doing detached or street work or in our centres, we could pick up those voices, whereas now as youth workers we're eliminated in that way. So yeah, what else is in our toolbox as a way to engage young people that maybe haven't, because of be it digital or for other restrictions, haven't been able to as equally be able to have their voices heard?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think we'd all like a Mary Poppins toolbox, wouldn't we, to be able to carry around with us. And again, I think also it's about for us to be able to come together as a sector and to say, right, okay, what is it that we need? So whether that is, do we need additional training? Do we need an opportunity like these webinars or the tea breaks that we have to be able to come together and share some of those best practice? And I think possibly going back to what Steph said about, when you lose something in terms of losing that face-to-face, but what are we gaining? I suppose in one respect, for those of us who are able to engage with technology, we're actually getting the opportunity to talk to colleagues that we probably would never have engaged with from the other side of the country to say, hey, Steph, what are you doing in terms of where you live? I'm really struggling in Blackpool to engage with young people to get their voice heard. What are you doing? And probably without this, we probably would never have possibly made those connections. So there is hopefully some good practice that we can start to develop. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on if that's okay with everybody, and just talk through a couple of the rest of the slides that we have. And again, please feel free, to jump in at any time. Can you all see that all right? Have I shared my screen okay? If somebody says yes, then I know I've shared it.
Oh, no, you haven't.
No, I haven't. There you go. You see, classic fail on Zoom. Although it could be worse. There was a gentleman who actually shared his screen, and he was a pussycat. There was a cat on. And he was I think he was a lawyer. That. Did you see that? Yeah. So there'll be no cats or dogs on here today. We're okay. Okay.
That's it. You have now.
I've got it now. Great. Thank you for that. Appreciate that. So again, just talking through, looking at the language, and I think somebody said, I think it might have been you, Lauren, that was talking about, young people have to see as youth workers that we are human. And obviously in that we're feeling some of the very similar emotions that they're feeling as well. But in terms of us and what we use as language, and when we talk about loss across in society, there's a lot of those analogies of, don't feel sad, don't feel down. Tomorrow is another day. If you've lost your first love, there's plenty fish in the sea. And it kind of like brings out this sort of like false idea that that somehow that we shouldn't allow ourselves to experience that sadness or that pain or those negative feelings, but actually by talking about it, that could actually help somebody within that process, of being able to think about how that loss or how that grief has actually had an impact or is having an impact on them, and really, I mean, one of the things I've put up there is about the approaches to loss. In truth, young people do not feel better. They just feel different. And there's not really a fix to a loss. One person might, lose something, and another person might lose the same thing, but actually how they feel and how they respond to that may be completely different. We talk about young people should be allowed to feel bad, and if their hearts are broken or they need to be heard, and to be able to talk that through without people putting that down or dismissing those feelings or their thoughts. So, for us to actually say, and I know we do that, actually, no, your voice matters, how you feel, that matters. And I'm here to listen to you and to talk you through and let you talk in a space where you can be open and say, I mean, how many of us will say COVID is having an impact on us and what we're losing is our loss, but you don't want to say it because you think there are people in worse situations, so you feel a little bit guilty saying, I don't want to talk about that. But you have every right to be able to talk that through with someone, to say, you know, actually, I'm not coping with this at the moment, or the loss of my disconnection with my colleagues or not being able to engage with as many young people is having an impact on me, and I need to talk that through. So again, there is no way I'm going to sit here and talk with my peers to advise you and to say about how you should communicate with young people. That's not at all what it's about. It's just about us being able to talk things through and about a guidance about how we communicate with young people who are experiencing that loss. And at the end of the day, you know the young people that you work alongside much better than anybody else on this webinar. But it's just an opportunity for us to really be able to, like I said, be able to reflect, look at that and actually say, right, okay, how would I approach this? What do I need? And if my toolbox is empty, where can I go to in a safe environment that I can actually ask for some of that support? And ultimately, just like everybody else, every young person is unique, and they all have their own individual needs. So one of the things that I wanted to talk through now was the element of that cultural competency. And one of the things that we're looking at here is, in particular, is around the role of the trusted youth worker versus the specialist. And some of the things that I wanted to be able to explore was really, was around that cultural competency, to actually have an awareness really and knowledge and understand the young people that we're working alongside. I will put this report, I'll try and get it and I'll put it in the chat, or it'll certainly be, if we can put it in with when we put it up onto the YouTube. But it was really interesting, this report that was written last year. So it was the Therapeutic Intervention for Peace report. And the report really challenged, looking at in terms of some of those issues about, for us really, and I'm saying us collectively, to really think differently about the levels of support provided to communities and whether the right people are delivering the support in the right way. And I just thought that that was a really interesting analogy really of actually about how we look at that. But in particular, being able to look at that through the lens of either the communities that we're working alongside, or in particular the young people, you know, and we could break that down into context, whether or not we're talking about culture, which George, you mentioned before, around working within the communities, or that could be around different social, environments. That could be around gender. You know, there could be various of elements of that. And there is a lot of work that's happening now, that has been happening over the last couple of years, around people with lived experiences, and those people who then become workers or volunteers within their communities, because they're able to actually say, you know, I understand where you're coming from. You know, we have an awareness of that. And what was really interesting from this report was that some of the clear recommendations, and in particular when we talked about trauma, crisis, loss and grief, was to really have much more of a community-based intervention, so that it was very much about, okay, let's work within these communities and what is actually needed. You know, does it need somebody from the community? Does it need somebody with some of those lived experiences to be able to talk with and work alongside some of those young people in the community, to really ensure that the provision that we're wanting to put into those communities or with that young person is actually working for them. And it's not kind of like, you know, well, we've got this model, so therefore we'll apply it to this particular young person. We all know that certainly doesn't work that way. There was also one of the recommendations within the report was a real strong acknowledgement of the role of that trusted youth worker, you know, and having that person as actually that frontline support for young people. So again, this is a little bit about, are we equipped to do that in terms of, you know, are we grief and loss counsellors, you know, are we trauma informed specialists? Well, we might not be, but we might be the conduit between actually having that person who is experienced and who is knowledgeable in that, being able to then engage with that young person and kind of like be that one that's that buffer that starts to facilitate some of those relationships, and that they're a person that you trust. There was obviously a powerful call for culturally competent community services within the local delivery. So again, you may have an area, I mean, I can do the analogy of Blackpool, or certainly the Fylde Coast, but within each of those areas within the Fylde Coast, whether that be Fylde, Blackpool or Wyre, within that community, there is a very uniqueness around that culture and that community as well, each of which would really lend itself to be able to have a more community and culturally competent approach. And then finally, something that we all talked about in terms of participation was to really have a role for young people to help shape the nature of that support. Again, please feel free to jump in if anybody wants to have any questions on this at all. And I think really when we look at this in regards to, you know, looking at the deficiency or the barriers in a system that kind of prevents individuals or communities from getting the help that they deserve. You know, one of the report was around looking around that therapy, you know, and is it always a viable option, you know, or are there other methods or other approaches that we can do to be able to work alongside, and particularly young people, to look at that, you know, and also, are we offering a service where actually that person or that community can actually see themselves within that service as well? You know, so have we actually stepped back and looked at actually how we're delivering it, who's delivering it, you know, the services as a whole, and can they actually say, do you know what, that's a service that I can actually trust. I can see that they will take on board my feelings, and obviously in my culture as well. And I just think that that's really, really important, and it's a significant value when we're talking about how we look at community-based, and especially around trauma and loss. Now, I did put in here a bit of a comfort break, but I'm very mindful it's 11:20, and time is of the essence. So if everybody's all right, if we can carry on, but please, by all means, if you want to go and grab a quick drink, because I do just have one last little session for you, or actually I think we could probably discuss it as a group, because there's only about 12 or 13 of us on here. So one of the things that I want us to think about, if we're talking about that cultural competency, is whether or not we want to give examples, you know, or a case study or a situation about, you know, how does that make youth workers feel when we talk about cultural competency, you know, and how do we define what our cultural competency is? And I'm going to stop sharing now, because I think I've spoken enough, really. And I just want people to, you know, open up your mics and have that conversation. How does that feel to you? What do you think about that? Is this a new thing, a new language that we're talking about? How do we feel? What do we think?
Can I come? I don't want my voice to be the only one being heard though. I'm really interested in cultural competency at the moment. We're doing some work in Leeds. There's a cultural cohesion quality mark which I'm working through, and I had a session kind of with our kind of advanced practitioners and so forth recently. And I think when it comes to kind of the cultural competency work or inclusion work, we as youth workers and practitioners tend to be better about engaging young people in that dialogue and understanding, but we're not very good as a workforce. We're not very good at looking at our workforce and asking those questions ourselves. And I've really really enjoyed these kind of webinars and tea breaks, because it's enabling me to have a bit of a think about where do I fit in that. And I think it's that kind of nod to us all. Yes, there's still lots of work we need to do to make sure we're inclusive to all communities, and you know, but actually as practitioners as well, let's not forget that in that process too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, George. And I think it's also an acknowledge again for us to say, actually, you know, I'm not probably the best person to be able to be doing with this. Who else do I have? So I know you can't possibly pull out a youth worker out of our toolbox, but it is that opportunity to actually say, you know, let's look at this, and are we giving the best service that we can within those communities, or to that particular young person? Absolutely. Anybody else?
I'll just add to George. So, guys, I'm recently back in the UK. I was in South Africa. I went back to South Africa, and so my context is slightly different. I've been more of a lecturer trainer with previously disadvantaged learnerships, so very similar to apprenticeships here, I suppose. And so this is a new territory to me, because and something that's just, it's talking to what George was talking about, is we would have these learners who came from really tough backgrounds, et cetera, and they would come to the school and they would sit in front of me, and, you know, they would want support. And I think for me, the biggest thing is this delivery, the follow through of that delivery, which is what you're talking about, is because it fell on me, and the system and the school and the setup and how we had in that community or in that context, there was no support. I think the UK is brilliant at it. There's so much more resource, you know, for that in terms of system. You know, I felt like, in reflection again, Debbie, in reflection, like I'd almost let those people down because I couldn't take it any further. Yeah. I couldn't, and it had such an impact on their lives. Some of them never finished their learnership. It's like 5 years later, I'm going back in my head going, how do I help them now, which, it's gone. But I think it's exactly what you're talking to. It's that follow through of delivery.
Yeah, it is. And I think, Steph, you really made a very valuable point there, because I think, if we say, well, we've got the cultural competency, we've got the right people in place, we're engaging with the community or with the young person, but then if the systems or if the follow-up or the ongoing, it then just becomes a bit of a tick box exercise, doesn't it? And again, young people will find that lost because they feel as though they've had that engagement, they've had their voices heard, things are changing, but then obviously if something then lets them down, it's right, okay, we're back to square one again, and having to possibly repeat their story over again with somebody else new, which again, we've sat here as a group of practitioners and have stopped the recording when we're possibly sharing some of our personal stories around loss. But for a young person, how many times do they have to really be able to share their story about loss with maybe 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 10 practitioners and different people? And for some of those people, through no fault of their own, may not be able to resonate or understand what that means to that young person if they've never been able to have that cultural competency. So I think it's something that is a really interesting topic that we could possibly discuss, for a long time. It would probably create, maybe it's just a session or a good couple of weeks for us to really unpick that. And again, after this webinar, please feel free to send any information or anything that you've got in terms of reflective practice back to us, because it would be really good to be able to discuss this further. Does anybody else have anything that they want to say? No? Okay, right. I'll just share my screen again, just as we're finishing. We're just coming to I can't believe it's nearly 11:30. That's gone very quick, hasn't it? Okay, so from the current one. Okay, so just this is kind of like a little bit of a final thoughts really, and looking around possibly like our praxis in terms of how we are as practitioners. And some of the evidence that shows that race and gender were definitely significant factors in the relationship between what they talk about in terms of, those prevailing sort of mental health conditions and mental well-being, but also in particular for young people in the community to actually be able to access that treatment and have some of those positive health outcomes, because ultimately that's what we really want, isn't it? We want to be able to create a service that has young people at the heart of it, that they feel as though that they're able to be able to access that and be able to then have those positive outcomes, whether that is in health or whether that's in their social lifestyle, and to be able to reach that potential. But obviously what it's suggesting here is that there are actually serious gaps in the way in which diverse communities are being served. So I think it's for us to really be able to think about that and to be able to take that away and say, well, actually, stepping back, and this may be something you might need to do within your organizations, within your teams, how do we as practitioners, youth and community worker practitioners, really ensure that young people's services are fit to serve the community, with those fluctuating risk factors amongst young people? And it would be really interesting for people to be able to go away and actually really think about that now and say, are our services fit? Are we okay to hold our hands up and say, actually, do you know what, we need to maybe look at reshaping or reviewing that? And my final thoughts is, I know that in terms of this loss, we've only had an hour and a half, but just for a final thought, to remember that young people do not need to be fixed. They just need to be heard. Anybody got any questions? Got two. Hey, we're all right. We're on time. I'm not going to get told off by anybody for going over. Anybody? I mean, I think certainly just to go on from that, that there really is a need to explore, more of those innovative approaches, as us as youth workers have, and really start to unpick, some of those approaches that do support young people as well, but also about looking at the value of what we provide as youth work practitioners and how we can really work alongside our colleagues, who do provide some of those therapeutic, interventions as well. And I would probably be as bold as to say, actually, some of the approaches that we have are actually more of those informal therapeutic and how we develop those relationships. So I think it will be really interesting to be able for you to take away possibly that question, and also to then think about, how in reality, how do we as a workforce start filling up that toolbox or that Mary Poppins bag, and maybe receive some more of those appropriate that appropriate training. And that could be something that could be like clinical supervision, you know, or elements of training or support. You know, there are some really good quick wins to that as well for us to be able to do it. Everybody's gone quiet, Kev. Honestly, they were really interactive.
I know, I've been there. It's been fascinating. Thank you, Debbie.
All right. I'm hoping
right.
that was worthwhile for everybody.
Good.
Really enjoyed it. Really good. Yeah.
Excellent. No, thanks, Debbie. That was a really useful and insightful way of dealing with quite a sensitive subject. So thank you. Thank you all for coming as well. It's it wouldn't have been as good without the conversation. Before you all go, at some stage, very, very soon, magically in the chat, a link to an evaluation form will appear. There it is. Yeah. So if you don't mind clicking on that before you go, then it'll open in your browser and you can fill it in at your leisure. We'd really like you to fill it in though, because it's useful for us. We're still doing a few more of these going forward, which hopefully you'll come to. There's some really good ones coming up. Actually linked to this one, there is one, I'm not entirely sure of the date because I haven't got it on this screen, but there is one about trauma-informed practice, which
there is.
Yeah. This one is run by an organisation called 42nd Street in Manchester, who are an excellent young people's mental health charity. So yes, if you fill out the form, hopefully we can use it to inform the development of further webinars, and the lottery who are paying for all of this will be interested in the feedback as well. So if you would take a bit of time to fill that in, that'd be great.
Kev, can I just say one thing just before everybody goes? This does sometimes conjure up, you know, maybe things that's happened to us in the past or we're currently going through now. So please, after this, go and do something nice. I've put something in there. Eat a biscuit, have a coffee, cuddle your dog, your cat, your partner, your child, you know, not the postman because you might get arrested for that, but just do something a little bit for you, because I think we do need to have some of that self-care and a bit of downtime. So please do try and do something. I'll look out the window and listen to the birds.
Charlie,
thank you very much.
In answer to your question, Charlie, it's on the 19th of this month at 10 a.m, the trauma-informed one. But all the details for all the forthcoming ones are on the website that you logged into to access this one. But yeah, the 19th at 10 a.m. is the trauma-informed practice one. Right, thank you all very much. Thank you, Debbie. And well, yes, hopefully we'll see you all again at future events. And thanks for coming. It's been great to see you all. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.